We're going to build an alternative internet. We are going down to OSI layer 1, 2, and 3, like the base layer architecture of the internet. And we're saying, instead of transmitting your data over this cable, which is run by Verizon or SK Telecom or something like that, transmit your data over this pathway. Solana and other fast chains may lap it. They may accelerate past it.
I want to dive into the Solana ecosystem a little bit later on. I want to talk about DoubleZero because I get the impression that there's a lot of questions around DoubleZero simply because you're, to the best of my knowledge, upgrading the internet, right? If that's a fair reduction of what it is that you're doing. How do you upgrade something like the internet that is not necessarily tangible? And why did you feel that moving away from Solana and building something that is much more holistic was the right decision?
Yeah, the internet, it's like super tangible. It's just hard to get your head around, right? The internet at the end of the day is underwater fiber cables. Like the internet's like, you don't really think about this when you're like on your phone, like with Wi-Fi or something like that, or on like, cell phone connectivity, but the internet is a giant network plugged into stuff. It's no different than the power grid. It's no different than oil pipelines from that perspective. Like it is all an interconnected network, the internet, right? And so the problem with the internet, though, is it was never built for high performance. It was built for high reach. The beauty of the internet is you can reach any point anywhere on the world from any other point on the world. It's not efficient, it's not fast, but you get there. If you try and load a website in Tokyo from here, it's kind of slow. So when we sort of set out to look at the problem set of DoubleZero, which is like the internet's not built for the type of data flow that you need for high performance distributed systems. It's built for a one-to-one relationship for the most part, which is one client, one server exchanging data back and forth. It's not really built for, I have a block produced here and I have to get it to 3,000 other places all over the world in 200 milliseconds. That's not something the internet's particularly good at. And so when we sort of say, hey, we're going to build like an alternative internet, what we are talking about is a physical fiber network in the ground of physical cables that are all interconnected to one another. But we don't have all of the business use cases that the internet has. So we can build this thing as an optimized network for high performance distributed systems, as opposed to building it as sort of a general purpose, good at most things, great at nothing type of internet, which is the one we have today.
That makes sense. What doesn't yet make sense to me is how much of a mouthful this is. Physical fiber infrastructure network.
Yeah.
Am I getting that correct?
Yeah.
Bit of a mouthful. Can we unpack that, please?
Sure. So let's look at BitTorrent, right? So BitTorrent is a global software network, effectively. BitTorrent is, your computer connects to a bunch of other computers out there over the internet. And over is like an important term. We say over the internet. We don't really think about what it means, but over the internet, a software layer on top of the internet that goes out and finds other computers and downloads copies of Linux, let's say, on BitTorrent. And that is an overlay network. It runs on top of the internet. Almost everything, like Ethereum is an overlay network. Solana is an overlay network. These are all protocols that run on top of the internet. What DoubleZero is effectively, it's an underlay protocol. We are going down to OSI layer 1, 2, and 3, like the base layer architecture of the internet. And we're saying, instead of transmitting your data over this cable, which is run by Verizon or SK Telecom or something like that, transmit your data over this pathway. And this pathway is the DoubleZero network, which is a physical fiber network all around the world.
And how do you get your hands on that much physical material to upgrade the internet? I mean, it sounds like it's a mammoth task, right? How long does something like that even take?
So the beauty of it is we don't have to build it ourselves. There's actually there's a ton of fiber that already exists in the world, much of which is underutilized. And so we've gone out and we've talked to a bunch of folks who have large amounts of fiber. Either they own it or they lease it for their own needs. And they usually have excess capacity and excess supply. And so our first network contributor was actually Jump Crypto. And they run a global fiber network because they're a global trading operation. And so they want to be able to arbitrage price differences between, the stock exchange in Japan and the stock exchange in New York City. And speed is the name of the game if you've read Flash Boys or something along those lines. But they have excess capacity. And what can they do with that capacity? Well, they can contribute it to DoubleZero. And we can then have much faster data pathways for getting data around the world than we would otherwise. And so we have 6 contributors at this point that are all contributing slices of global fiber networks to the DoubleZero protocol. We're in about, I think, 22 cities at the moment with our mainnet build out and expanding it out from there. We've got great coverage throughout North America. We've got actually, for the first time, some lines into South America at this point, where it's very hard to profitably run validators at this point. Europe, Asia, quite well covered. We're working on some connectivity into the Middle East and Dubai, working on potentially getting a line down to South Africa as well. And the whole idea here is to expand where in the world it's possible to actually run Solana validators without facing penalties.
For the younger audience who might have, been exposed to this type of technology discussion through the COVID period, it sounds like almost piggyback shipping logistics around the world for drop shipping companies. Is that a fair analogy? There's excess capacity on a ship somewhere, and the ship's already going there, and you might as well just utilize that extra space.
Yeah, I mean, all this fiber is already run, right? Running new fiber is extremely expensive. We are not at a position where we're actually running new fiber yet. But the way to think about this is like every large technology company gets to a place where the growth of their software product is limited by hardware. It's usually limited by connectivity. So you look at like Facebook. Facebook spent billions of dollars at this point wiring up many, many countries with internet. Like they literally wired up the Philippines with fiber optic cables so they could sell people ads. They tried to do the same thing in India. They've done it in a lot of other countries. And they're building one of the world's largest and this new fiber initiative that's this big cable that's going to basically go around the southern hemisphere as an alternative pathway to all the data that mostly moves through the northern hemisphere at the moment. And this is like Meta. It's like, what are they? This is a company that like makes Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook. What are they doing building cables? Well, it turns out the public internet is not that good when you get to the size of a company like that. You want to be able to share an Instagram story that your friend posted in New York. You want to be able to load it when you're in Istanbul, and it needs to be that quick. The public internet's not great for that. And so even a company like Meta now is getting into the fiber business. Google and Amazon and the cloud providers have been in this business for a long time, but the physical connectivity network is the main bottleneck there. And the challenge is these are all centralized companies running centrally managed networks. That won't fly in blockchain. You can have a centralized company build the software package for the thing, but what you need is independent network contributors to have checks and balances and crypto economic security and all these things we know and love securing these network links. And that's why it's really important. We're starting off, we have 6 contributors at the moment to the network. We're trying to get that number up, but that is more decentralized than any pathway that Solana validators or Ethereum validators, for that matter, are currently talking over.
Interesting. You mentioned something there. I want to sort of circle back to you for a second. Huge companies obviously get to a certain point where they have enough funds that they can think about, literally changing the physical landscape in which they operate. I would imagine fundraising is quite important for a younger company, like younger organization like DoubleZero. And I'm under the impression that you guys went for a fairly interesting, rogue, by some measures, way of fundraising. So if you could sort of explain that to me, and I think, why do people find that interesting? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, so we did a traditional fundraising round back in December. Multicoin and Dragonfly were the co-leads on that. But one thing we did this spring was we actually did, and the terminology is kind of hard here, we did a token sale to validators. And so what that basically meant is we teamed up with CoinList and we built a bunch of infrastructure that allows a validator to sign with their validator keys to basically authenticate that they do run a network. They do run a validator. And they would be able to basically place bids and buy tokens.
And I think this is where the confusion sort of comes from, right? Like the value that's ascribed to the token allocation to these validators.
Yeah, so the way this kind of worked is you have to think about it from the perspective of like, who are the most important contributors to the DoubleZero network? The first is the fiber providers. If there's no fiber, there's no network. The second one are the validators, right? Because if the validators aren't operating on the network, there's some value, but the real value comes when we have enough validators connected in DoubleZero that the folks at Anza and Firedancer and Solana Foundation can say, okay, we're going to 10x the network's requirements. And we can 10x the throughput. We can go up to 100,000 transactions per second, 400,000 transactions per second. We get into crazy numbers pretty quickly. And so, from that perspective, we need validators connected into DoubleZero. And so one of the really cool things that Solana Labs did in the early days, and this was kind of accidental, it was mostly because they were running out of money in like late 2020.
Hard to imagine.
People forget that like Solana was not a success for the first year by any metrics.
Yeah.
It actually launched without smart contracts even. Like the folks in the early days, this is before I joined, went through Herculean efforts to actually even get the network launched, and it obviously paid off. But they did this sale out to their validators in like fall of 2020 because no one else would give them money. And they were like, oh, these validators clearly believe in us. What if we let them buy tokens? Turned out to be, an injection of capital was very important for the success of the network, but it also meant these validators had a significant upside in the long-term success of the network.
Was the transparency of that decision questioned at the time as well? I know there was a lot of criticism about, it was called a VC chain. It was people criticizing for being centralized. So the reason why I'm asking that is there seems to be some sort of question marks around, the parallels between what Solana did and what DoubleZero is doing now, maybe with regards to transparency.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's like, I would say hard about crypto nowadays is it's valuable, right? And so you don't like, the beauty of like the way Bitcoin or Ethereum was able to launch is no one believed in them. No one believed in Solana either at the beginning. And it's kind of funny because people will throw this accusation of, VC chain around. The token was under 25 cents for over a year. Like any retail, and I think the FDV was like below 500 million for most of that time. Anyone who wanted to believe in that chain had entrance price availability that was almost as good as like the early VCs that invested in that network. And so it's kind of like, it's one of those things where you can look at the holdings and you can say like, oh, like a bunch of holdings may be held by VCs. But the real question is like, what was the opportunity? And if there was opportunity that people didn't take advantage of, and professional investors who are paid to think about asymmetric returns were like, oh, we think this could be an asymmetric return. Like, that's not privileged access. That's not special access. That's just like, I know it's not popular to say, but like professional investors are pretty good at their jobs. That like working for a VC is not an easy job in the sense of like, you can't be an idiot really and do that.
Or you're going to lose all your money very quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
As many of them do.
As many of them do, right? The average return in VC is like negative 1%. The returns are very lopsided, right? Most of your companies you invest in fail, some succeed. Retail usually doesn't have an appetite for that. But from Solana's perspective, like you could have bought in for a very long time at a very good entry price.
So was that the driver behind the decision to essentially offer behind closed doors, from what I understand, validators the ability to sort of decide how much token they want to buy and at what price, and then create a bit of a sort of not so transparent auction?
For us at DoubleZero?
Yes.
So what I would say is it was open to every validator. It was a coin list, public listing page. We tweeted about it. We did Twitter spaces about it. We shouted about it from the rooftops. They did the same thing. Press releases were sent out about it. So none of that was, I would say, not transparent from that perspective.
Okay.
It was only open to validators, and they do have to pass KYC. There's nothing we can do about KYC laws and those sorts of things. So like, that's true of any investment.
Mm-hmm.
And, we had actually a great amount of validators participate. We ended up getting over 200 Solana validators participating, and actually like not even bidding, like completing and purchasing tokens through that process.
I don't mean to rush you along here, but I also really am curious about where the interest came from beyond those Solana validators, because I'm under the impression that it wasn't just limited to Solana, right?
No, we opened it up to Aptos and Sui and Celestia and some Avalanche as well.
Who was the hungriest out of all the groups of validators that you spoke to, if there was any sort of agreement among them?
So Solana was the largest portion by a good amount, but we had, over 10% of the Sui and Aptos stake participating in it as well. There was a good amount of interest from Celestia. We had almost no interest from the Avalanche folks.
Interesting.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
No idea. I think that the validator overlap between Solana and like Sui and Aptos is actually pretty big. Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot more validators on Solana, but I think the folks who believed in Solana early and saw the performance and characteristics of the chain were sort of primed to look and say like, what could be, if not a Solana killer? Because I don't think it's possible to kill Solana.
Not anymore.
But the pie is growing, right? And so like, Sui or Aptos or Monad or Mega ETH can be very successful without dethroning Solana. If any protocol makes it into the top 10 nowadays, even if that position is 9, they're doing incredibly well. And so I think that's why there's a bit of an overlap there.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Solana killer, not a possibility anymore. I mean, we spoke about sort of community-led events and the fact that the foundation's even thinking about dissolving itself, right? Which I think really underscores that idea.
Yeah.
ETH killer was another term that got thrown around. I know you care deeply about the Ethereum ecosystem and you have strong polarizing opinions, but you want it to succeed at the end of the day. Is it possible that ETH killers exist or will exist?
I mean, you can't kill an open source project, right? Like Microsoft tried for years to kill Linux, and like Linux just kept succeeding. As long as there's people who want to develop and build on Ethereum and believe in the EVM and believe in the vision, which I see no signs of that going away, you're never going to kill Ethereum. The question is really just around mindshare, market dominance, all these other things. But, you know, truly, if you are like in it for the tech, as people used to say, like you just need the price to be enough that people are still willing to put their time and effort into it.
Very interesting. I was talking to Ansem, I think, yesterday or the day before, and he said, I don't think ETH will ever be above 2K again, just because you mentioned price. I'm curious what you think about that.
I hope not. Like, I hope it gets above 2K again.
Yeah.
Like, there's so much that happens when an incumbent in any type of system falls. Whether it is, you know, the collapse of Enron, whether it is the DOJ suit against Microsoft, whether it is, you know, the fall of the Soviet Union, all of these moments create huge amounts of volatility and disruption. And sometimes that disruption is great. Sometimes, you know, that disruption's not great. And so I don't think Ethereum has to fail for Solana to succeed or even surpass it necessarily, right? And so I would much rather see Ethereum continue to be a successful project. Solana and other fast chains may lap it. They may accelerate past it, right? But it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with what's taking place there. I mean, in some ways, it is the logical conclusion. Like Ethereum made a conscious choice to push execution out onto the L2s. And so if you add up all of the market cap of all of the L2s and you add it to Ethereum's market cap, that's still a very big number. The difference is it's become fractured into multiple tokens. But that was the point, right? The point of L2s were to fracture Ethereum into multiple independent things that we call L2s. And so a little bit of this is like, this was the choice that community made, was sort of to go not exactly the Cosmos route, but closer to the Cosmos route.
Very diplomatic response. I would like to unpack that. But then if we want to embody this idea of accelerate, then surely you want your opponent to also be accelerating, right? And if your biggest sort of competition in some sense is Ethereum, and Ethereum's got this figurehead that is too communist, then surely that forces us to be something that's opposite to that to a certain
Sure,
right?
but I think the difference is you don't see Ethereum accelerating, you see it decelerating, right? And like there's like folks still trying to do like good work, right? Like the folks at Mega ETH are building a very cool thing, but in order to build a very cool thing, they had to give up on a bunch of like core tendencies that used to be like, you know, handed down from on high about how L2s are supposed to operate. And so we also got rid of the committees. There were supposed to be state committees in L2s. The whole point of a centralized sequencer was like, all it does is ingest, and then you have a whole series of validators that are supposed to verify the state transitions and all that. I think like one of the things that I have seen happen like again and again is that it's much easier to scale through charity than economics. And we've seen this kind of again and again in like the Ethereum space where like, there's just a lot of people who are very rich on ETH and they're willing to subsidize a lot of things happening because of that, right? And like, and on one level, that's awesome. But what they're subsidizing is not open source tooling. It's actually like integral things to the functioning of a network that are like ongoing operational requirements. Like PBS is not, like MEVBoost is not profitable, right? That's an economic failure. The desire to remove all I mean, like there are people who just like sucked execution out of Ethereum for years. And like, I was never a fan of like, so I was in Ethereum before I joined Solana, right? I was working at Bison Trails and we were doing a bunch of work on the sharding L2 roadmap for ETH2. And like there were some cool ideas there, right? About this, like, oh, we're gonna have 1,000 shards, we're gonna have a canonical bridge that's run by like the Ethereum protocol. And instead what we have is we have this like deeply fractured Ethereum-esque ecosystem where code's barely compatible. Like everyone's like, oh, my universal bridge works great. Like, oh, how universal is it? Like it works between all the OP stack chains. You're like, well, it's not universal. And then
Not
so
universal at all, really.
yeah, and then so like folks are going off to like other alt bridges, which are totally good and fine, like Wormhole and D-Bridge and Altbridge and all these other things, but they have no relationship to Ethereum,
Right.
right? And like bridges generate revenue. Like there's so many ways that like the core problem with the Ethereum L1 today is it's not worth paying for. Like settlement is not expensive. All these networks are paying, like Base is paying, I think about $1.5 million a year for settlement to Ethereum, and they make about $500 million a year in ETH fees. That is that is terrible margins for Ethereum, right? And so it's not that like, oh, you need to charge more for settlement or charge more for blobs. It's you got to have more features in the L1 that are worth paying for by the L2s.
I know Max Resnick was quite passionate about some of the points that you touched on there, and I'm curious if you think you're going to see more researchers sort of abandoning ship and maybe moving not just to more profitable bridges, but different ecosystems altogether, and then becoming evangelists of that new ecosystem, as Max Resnick conveniently for us has done.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because like you go back and look at the history of Solana, and very few people came from the Ethereum ecosystem. It was really like a parallel effort that got built up. And most of the builders on Solana, like they're not people who like built a very successful thing on Ethereum and then went to build a very successful thing on Solana. They're people who like entered the blockchain ecosystem as Solana being the first place they build, or the first place they seriously decided to build. And so like Max is one of the few people that's like, oh, I was in Ethereum, I worked for Consensus, I was, all these, and then decided to come over. But he's brought a lot of really good ideas and a lot of sort of new thinking to the Anza team.
And hot takes.
And hot takes, yes.
Which we love. We love hot takes. We love unfiltered hot takes because I think it drives the conversation and, accelerates. It accelerates the conversation. I like wordy explanations, but a lot of people don't have time for it. They just want to consume content on 2 times speed. So
sure, it's true. I mean, I will say that like the Ethereum ecosystem has a very good culture of research. What it doesn't have is a great culture of productionization. So like there's some really cool talks at like Build Asia about like new fundamental research work going on in Ethereum about like very cool proof systems and things like that. And like it's awesome. It's really like, but it never gets integrated into core, right? It's sort of like you can kind of think about it as like we used to have like in the United States like government funded research programs that would then turn into government funded technology programs, which would then maybe someday turn into like a public company or something like that. But like we have this weird thing now where like research comes out of universities and the universities like monetize the IP themselves and then they like try and sell it to a big tech company, as opposed to like if the government funds research, all research funded by the government is open source. People kind of like forget that, but like a lot of that fundamental research, like anything the government is a primary producer of, like is owned by the people. And so instead what we sort of have in like Ethereum is we have like Succinct Labs is very cool, but it shouldn't have to be its own company.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of this stuff where it's like either like imagine how much worse Firedancer would be if it had to make money itself.
Right. No, absolutely.
That would be, or Anza even for that matter, right? That would be catastrophic. We'd have like the Firedancer private mempool and like the Anza mev boost and all this stuff. And it's like, this is why the foundation exists. It's to fund this type of stuff. And yes, it's great if they can bring in some other revenue from other areas, but like there's this like there's this very like strong line between like what is something that should not be monetized and something that should be monetized. And a lot of what happens, it feels like in the Ethereum space, is a lot of stuff that should not be monetized ends up getting a company built around it. And then they have a token for no reason. And then they have to launch a token. And like, that's why we have 10,000 L2s that have about 40 users each. It's not that they're not good tech. There's a lot of very good tech there, but it's like, would you rather have all of these like small things competing with one another? Or would you rather like, I mean, it really feels like you go back to like the 18th century and you've got like all like 360 German principalities and then like Bismarck just sweeps through and it's like, oh, this is all Germany now, right? And it's like, we kind of need like some moment of that, I feel like, in the L2 landscape, if this is really gonna like if Ethereum is going to maintain its market dominance, there's always going to be incredible tech being created on Ethereum, and you can't kill open source projects. But like, it's this funny thing where it's like, you look at like, how much mindshare does Oracle have? Name a single Oracle product. Oracle now actually, like, their stock has performed better than Amazon or Google over the last 5 years.
Aren't they also advising the White House now?
I think probably.
Yeah, I think.
You know, but it's like those sorts of things where you can have a very successful thing but doesn't necessarily have mind share. You know, a thing that has a high mind share but isn't necessarily economically successful. Linux is the classic example of this. The most important software package ever created in human history that is entirely funded by goodwill.
I can sense your passion. I can sense that you care a lot about Ethereum, even though, you know, you have obviously quite negative conclusions about it. You want the best for this.
Yeah, I mean,
in many ways, right?
And there's still very much a turnaround that could happen for things on Ethereum.
I want to ask you very shortly about the Solana Foundation as well.
Sure.
You mentioned grants, funding, leadership obviously ties into what we're talking about with Vitalik earlier and you know, Ethereum's sort of central decision-making structure. But the Solana Foundation, they announced that they're going to sort of work towards dissolving themselves, and some of the heavy hitters, the OGs, have, like yourself, walked away from the Solana Foundation. Curious what you think the impact of that's going to be in the long run, right? Chase is another sort of public-facing figure who said, going to pursue other things now. I get the impression that there is a consensus that the Solana Foundation should decentralize even further and allow community-led events like Crossroads to sort of fill that gap, if you will. But I also get the feeling that some people are really scared. Some people think there's just going to be a massive sort of gaping void of leadership left there. So what's going to happen when, and if and when, the Solana Foundation really is just withering away?
Yeah, so I mean, I was at Solana Labs, then Foundation, for 4 years, and 4 years is a long time in this industry, right? I think a lot of like OGs from Solana Labs and Solana Foundation leaving isn't like inherently bad, because if you're a founder of a thing, like, you're stuck there for life, right? That is like that's what you're doing. Like, unless the project fails, like, that is your identity and that is your sort of destiny. The foundation, I never thought of it as somewhere that was like a Facebook where like people stay for like 10 or 15 years, right? Because at the end of the day, the foundation is a support organization more than anything else. It doesn't have a ton of engineers. It's not actually building a ton of stuff itself. It's primarily like marketing, grants, support, like soft leadership, a bunch of these other type of characteristics. And you can't have too much turnover, or else it sort of becomes like a bit of a whiplash, and it can be hard to figure out exactly what the foundation's doing. But like, you know, at its core, you've got like Dan and Lily, who are the two people running the foundation, and they're probably there for a very, very long amount of time. But everyone else, like, you get to a place where you're sort of like, oh, am I going to be here for the next 8 years? And I'm going to be sort of like happy in this role. And there's a bunch of people who may be great for that, right? But for the most part, you actually don't want the smartest and best people working at the foundation, because you don't need it. You know, you need it when the foundation might be starting. You need it during something like the collapse of FTX. But nowadays, like, if the foundation is 20% worse at doing what it does, I don't think that really matters that much.
Is that because the ecosystem has evolved by 200% and that really
Yeah. So this is like look at someone like Cash. Like, Cash is a great trade, right? Cash was like, oh man, like, sucks that he's no longer at Foundation and he's not doing this like super team stuff anymore. At the same time, like, the impact he can have and the positive effects on the ecosystem are way higher at Jupiter than they were like running super team stuff. Because super team stuff, like, it matters, but it doesn't matter that much at the end of the day.
Maybe
like, Jupiter matters way more than a super team, right? And like the power of super team is not like the fact that it exists. It's the fact that people join it, work for it for a year or two, and are like, oh, I know how to build a company now, and then they leave, right? And so the foundation, I mean, for me, it was the best training you could ever ask for to go be a founder.
I was going to say, it sounds like it was a bit of a leadership accelerator in some sense as well.
Completely, yeah.
Yeah. So you still look back on your time at the foundation quite fondly.
Oh yeah, it was incredible. In some ways, like, leaving's like the stupidest thing I've ever done, right?
Yeah.
But like, this is how it goes. Like, you get to a place where you're like, well, Dan and Lily aren't going anywhere, so I either have to be happy with what I'm doing here for the long term, the next 8 years or something like that, or like go out and try and do your own thing. And I really do think you have a cap on being a founder. I don't think 19-year-olds generally make great founders, but at the same time, if you don't have some experience effectively being a founder or being on a leadership team, and you haven't made that jump before you're in your like mid to late 30s, it's very hard to do it in your 40s and 50s. And like you do age out of being able to grind at that level. And like people will tell you, oh no, you can keep doing it. But you're like, most of these like founders who are older, they're not putting in 12-hour days, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but they're more of like a executive leadership of an organization. They've got an incredible team.
The long hours.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean they can't make an incredible impact. I mean, just look at what Tim Cook has done at Apple. I don't expect that person's not taking any vacation and is working 12 hours every day, doesn't have dinner with their family. And like, there's different periods that you get into with this.
Speaking of different periods, just trying to slide into your DMs since your chief strategy officer days at Foundation. But having had this conversation with you now, I'm very grateful that you're making time to talk to us as a founder, and letting us understand sort of that journey that you're going through right now. I want to end on a very bullish note. What makes you the most excited about the Solana ecosystem over the next 12 months?
It's hard to talk about like specific technologies that are coming. I mean, one of them is like the folks at Anza have committed to doubling the amount of compute units available on the network before the end of 2025. And that's a huge change and advantage. I will say it's the continued drive and a relentless focus on performance. It's not resting on your laurels when, we have like big successes on the network. It's this sort of always, what's next? What's the next performance increase that can happen? What's the best application that can be built on top of it? And it's sort of the desire to never be satisfied. I think that is what makes me most excited about the future of this ecosystem.